I've got several new chisels here, none of which has ever been sharpened. Stick around and I'll show you how I get my chisels super sharp. I'm Greg Swenson and this is the Swenson Woodshop. Thanks for selecting my channel. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to click the subscribe button and the little bell for notifications when I upload new videos. This is the second in a 4-part video series on how to sharpen woodworking tools. If you haven't already watched part 1, I recommend that you circle back and watch that video as well, since it contains some fundamental information that this video builds on. I've got several different types of chisels here. This is a standard bevel edge chisel, also called a bench or paring chisel. It's the most common type of chisel and is generally used by most woodworkers for just about every task that requires a chisel. This is a mortising chisel. It's used specifically for chopping out mortises. The thicker sides help keep the chisel straight in the cut, provide strength for leveraging waste out of the cut. This is a corner chisel. It's used to square up rounded corners in a mortise, typically cut using a router or by drilling out the waste. And this is a fishtail chisel. It's generally used to clean up half-blind dovetails, but it's also useful for paring in hard-to-reach areas. This bevel edge chisel is somewhat sharp with the factory edge, but I think with a little work, it can be a whole lot sharper. I prefer to hollow grind the bevel surface to minimize the amount of metal that needs to be honed and polished. I talked about flat grinding versus hollow grinding in video 1 of this series, so I won't belabor that subject again here. I suggest you circle back to video 1 of the series for more discussion on that subject. Suffice to say, I hollow grind to expedite the sharpening process. With that being said, I don't hollow grind the specialty mortise, corner, or fishtail chisels. I've adjusted the tool rest on my grinder to position the hollow grind for this chisel. And I've put some black magic marker on the bevel surface so I can see where the wheel is contacting the bevel. I've set the speed control to about 1200 RPM, so I should be able to grind this chisel without a significant and potentially detrimental heat buildup. I have this alignment guide for grinding the chisel square that I made by cutting down an aluminum speed square. Well, it looks good. I never grind all the way to the cutting edge. I'll start with the 5000 grit stone to see how close to flat this chisel is. If I'm lucky, maybe I can skip the coarser grit. I'll use a technique of moving the chisel on and off the stone as I move up and down the length of the stone to prevent any crowning at the tip and to evenly distribute the wear across the whetstone. Ooh, that looks nice. Let's switch to the 8,000 grit. Let's see what the 12,000 looks like. You can read the H2O in the reflection on the back of that chisel. I think that's pretty good. With the backside polished, we can now hone the bevel. I use a honing guide, so I need to set the protrusion or the angle of the chisel in the honing guide. This chisel has a primary bevel ground at 30 degrees, and I'm not adding a micro bevel, so I'll use the 30-degree stop on my angle jig. It won't take much to hone the narrow margin on this chisel, since I've hollow ground the bevel. I'll start honing with the 5,000 grit stone. The little black magic marker on the cutting edge will help me see exactly where I'm contacting the stone. Okay, we've got good contact with the cutting margin. We'll give it a few strokes here on the 5,000 grit stone. A little bit more. You'll know when you've reached a zero radius edge and you're ready to move to the next finer grit when you feel a burr on the back side of the cutting edge. The burr can be difficult to see without magnification, but you should be able to feel it if you rub the edge against a sensitive part of your hand. You've got a small burr there. I'll give it a little bit more. That's good. I'll knock that down a little on the back side. And let's switch over to the 8,000 grit. We'll clean up the wheel on the honing guide so we don't transfer any coarse abrasive to the next finer grit stone. Okay, feel the burr there again. And I'll knock that down again. Yeah, that just grabs the back of my nail the second I touch it. That's sharp. So much for my script. This is a mortise chisel. It's used for chopping mortises and not really for paring, so its edge doesn't need to be as keen as the bevel edge chisel. I don't hollow grind mortise chisels, and I don't worry about honing and polishing the large bevel surface on this type of chisel. The primary bevel on this chisel is ground at 30 degrees. I'm going to polish the backside and then add a secondary bevel honed at 35 degrees to give the edge a little more strength for chopping. The sides of the mortise chisel are ground square to the back surface and actually cut or scrape the sides of the mortise as the chisel is pounded into and levered out of the wood. Polishing the backside of the chisel gives these edges a little more sharpness. But we don't need to go overboard on getting these edges super sharp because the nature of a mortise allows for a somewhat rougher surface. I've flattened my stones. I'll polish the back of the chisel first, starting with the 1500 grit stone and work through the grits. And now the 12,000. And let's see. I think that's pretty good for a mortising chisel. I've reflattened my whetstones. Now I need to change the jaws on my honing guide to hold this type of mortise chisel before I can set the protrusion or angle of the chisel in the guide. I'll use the 35-degree stop for this secondary bevel. I hesitate to call it a micro bevel because it's going to be a little wider than a normal micro bevel. Since this chisel doesn't already have a secondary bevel, I'll start with a 1500 grit stone. It won't take much to create the bevel. Okay, let's switch to the 5,000 grit. Uh, 8,000 grit. Let's knock down the burr. And we'll try the 12,000 grit. Yeah, I think we're there. Let's see if we can get this on camera. There's the secondary bevel. And the back side. This is a corner chisel. It's used for squaring up the corners of mortises generally cut using a router or drilled out. Like the Mortise Chisel, it's used with a mallet for chopping actions and not really for paring, so its edge doesn't need to be as keen as a bevel edge chisel. To sharpen this chisel, I'll polish the sides, then hone the inside bevels. This is one type of chisel where a honing guide just doesn't work. I'll have to sharpen this chisel freehand. I've reflattened my whetstones. Now I'll polish the back sides of the chisel, starting with the 1500 grit stone and working my way through the grits. All right, that looks good for the 1500 grit. Let's step up to the 5000. Okay, let's try the 8000 for a little while. Okay, I think we're ready for the 12,000 grit. And that looks pretty good, I think, for the 12,000 grit. So I think we're done with the polishing step. Now we'll move on to honing the bevel. I've reflattened my whetstones. Now I'll hone the inside bevels. To sharpen this chisel, I'll register the bevel on the edge of the whetstone and lift up slightly as I'm pulling backwards. I'll continue with that stroke until I feel a burr on the backside. I'll start with the 1500 grit whetstone. Okay, let's move over to the 5000 grit. Let's move to 8000 grit. Okay. Okay. And we'll knock down the burr on the backside. Okay, and that sharpens our corner chisel. Let's see if we can get a good view of this. Here's the inside bevels, all nicely polished, and the back side. Okay. Up next, our Fishtail Chisel. So this is a Fishtail Chisel. It's used to clean up half-blind dovetails, but it's also useful anytime you do some paring in hard-to-reach areas. The thin shaft lets you get into recesses that a standard chisel might not. Like a bevel edge chisel, the edge needs to be very sharp for paring and the back flat for registering the chisel. To sharpen this chisel, I'll polish the back, then hone the bevel. This is another example of a chisel where a honing guide won't work. The thin, round, tapered shaft won't clamp in firmly in any of the honing guides I have. I guess I'll be sharpening this chisel freehand. I've reflattened my whetstones. Now I'll polish the backside starting with the 5000 grit stone and work through the grits. Okay, we'll try the 8000 now. And we'll go move up to the 12,000. And there you go. The back's got a nice polish on it. I've reflattened my whetstones again. Now I'll hone the bevel. I'll register the bevel on the whetstone and roll up as I pull backwards slightly, continuing that stroke until I feel a burr on the back side. I'll start with the 5000 grit stone and work through the grits. Yeah, there's the burr. Let's knock that down. And move up to the 8,000. Yeah, and there's the burr. And there we go. Nice polished bevel. Polished backside. We felt the burr, so we know we have a 0 radius edge. Yep, grabs my thumbnail instantly. Sharp chisel. So that's my process for sharpening 4 types of woodworking chisels. It's pretty straightforward and fairly simple. Polish the back side of the cutting edge and work the bevel with each grit until you feel a burr on the back side. Follow those simple rules and you'll get 0 radius sharp edges every time. You also need a little patience. It takes time to establish a sharp edge, particularly on new or damaged tools. The raw video I shot for this chisel sharpening segment would easily add an additional 30 to 40 minutes to what is already a long video by YouTube standards if I didn't edit out much of the lengthy honing, polishing, and reflattening scenes. I doubt even the most die-hard of woodworkers really wants to watch this stuff in real time. But once you've established that edge, it usually only takes a few strokes on the backside and maybe a little more in the bevel to restore a sharp edge in normal use. Now if I can only find a honing guide big enough for this bad boy. So sit back and relax, maybe get yourself some popcorn, or better yet, some pizza, and watch part 3 of my video series on how to sharpen plane irons, and then part 4 on scrapers. Oh, and if you haven't already watched part 1 on the basics, circle back and watch that as well. Till next time, I'm Greg Swenson, and this has been the Swenson Woodshop.